Hi guys! Happy Halloween! Today I want to show you the full process of how I made these awesome jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween. Last year I made some pumpkins and they were a lot of fun, but this year I wanted to take it to the next level and carve the pumpkins to make jack-o'-lanterns. Before the clay was ready to throw on the wheel, I wedged the clay and measured out balls of a good size. In this case, I weighed out about 2 pounds per pumpkin. That gives a good-sized, smallish pumpkin without making them too small to carve. Once the clay was weighed and wedged, it was on to one of my very favorite parts, throwing on the wheel. It's super satisfying to take clay from a ball to a pot, or in this case, a pumpkin. To make these pumpkins, I threw a hollow sphere that I later shaped to be more pumpkin-like. Throwing a hollow shape like this is called closed form, and it's not easy. It starts like any other pot with centering and opening the clay and pulling walls, but then it needs to be closed at the top, and plenty of things can go wrong there. I'm not ashamed to admit I had a couple of failures while making these. Pottery is an ongoing learning process, and I don't throw closed form very often, but I'm happy to report that I was able to turn most of the balls of clay into hollow spheres. So then I moved on to the next step of making these. I let them dry to a soft leather hard and then wired them off the bat so they would be ready to shape. You'll see that one pumpkin here and there as we go along that's the same size but not carved. That one got too dry to carve, but I managed to shape it still. It can be tricky to get back to working on pottery when they're just the perfect dryness when I have other things going on, like, kids and homeschooling and such. So one pumpkin is a pumpkin and not a jack-o'-lantern, and that's okay. After they were all wired off, I began shaping them more. The first step was to poke a hole in the pumpkin, so that way I could shape it without popping it. I pushed in the top of the pumpkin, so it was less of a sphere and more pumpkin-like. Then I smoothed out the bottom a bit more. I could have made a chuck and trimmed them on the wheel, but smoothing the base with a rib works just fine for this project, as I'd gotten rid of most of the excess clay around the base when I was throwing it. To make it really look like a pumpkin, I used my wooden rib to add the ribs or the divots in the surface of the pumpkin. I first made the marks lightly, and then I go back and make the marks much deeper before smoothing them. This part's fun because it's where the pumpkin shape really starts to emerge. You'll note that it doesn't have a stem yet. That really helps it look like a pumpkin too, but it would just get in the way at this point, so that part comes later. So more shaping and more smoothing, and it's looking pretty darn good. I decided it would be easier to add the stem if the top was off of the pumpkin, so I cut the top off next. That way I can push on the join from both sides and get a better connection where the stem attaches. I cut the top off like I would with an actual pumpkin, and it felt kind of funny because it wasn't a real pumpkin. I cut it at an inward angle so the lid would stay in place, and I cut a notch so it would be easy to line up later. Then, of course, more smoothing to make everything look good. I repeated the same step with all the pumpkins I was making. I prefer to do one step on each piece so they're all finished at about the same time when I'm working on a batch of pots like this. It just makes more sense to me. Once they were all smoothed, shaped, and had the lids cut off, it was finally time for the stems. I like a bit of curl or a twist in the stem, so I made a several inch long tapered coil to start out with. I flattened out the wider end and scored it and attached it to the lid with vinegar. I find vinegar works great, and it's easier than keeping slip-on hand at all times. Once the stem was attached, I added some lines with a carving tool to make it look like it has ridges, like a real pumpkin stem. I added a curl in the stem and arranged it to my liking, and then the basic shape of the pumpkin was all done. Then I got to do another one of my favorite parts of this project, which was carving the faces on the pumpkins. I really enjoyed coming up with different designs for the pumpkin faces and giving them each their own little personality. I kept each carving pretty simple, opting for a few more bold features than a smaller, more complex design. I'm a big fan of easy but yet impactful designs. I cut out the initial shape for each part of the faces and then went back and cleaned them up, smoothing any rough parts and getting them looking their best. I really love how each and every one turned out. I left them alone for a while to dry and then fired them in a bisque load in my kiln with the lids on. They all came out looking really good. Look how cute they are! Then it was time to glaze them before firing them again. I used Mako Stroke and Coat for these. It's a good stable glaze that has nice vibrant colors and works well for things like this. You can see that I also glazed my mini pumpkins at the same time, since I used the same glazes on them as well. I'll explain how I made those in my next video. They were made slightly differently, so be sure to come back and check out that video once it's posted. For the bigger jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, I just glazed the outside of them and the carved parts of the face as well. I left the inside unglazed, as glaze wasn't really needed, and quite frankly, glaze is pricey. Plus, I like the contrast between the glazed outside and the unglazed inside in the final product, as it makes the carved parts a bit more visible, I think. Even though they aren't quite finished, they look so good with some color on them. Then it was time for the final firing. This time I fired them with their lids off so the glaze would not fuse them shut. Glaze melts when fired and permanently sticks to anything it's touching, so the bottom of the lids and the bottom of the pumpkins were left unglazed to avoid them sticking to the kiln shelf, and I left the lids off so they could be opened again. The final firing is a higher temperature and takes longer than a bisque firing. It also takes longer to cool down, and it's always a bit hard to wait to see the final result of the pots. But finally, the jack-o'-lanterns were done! The faces are super cute. The lids fit, and they just look great. I really honestly can't pick a favorite, but if you have a favorite, I'd love to know what your favorite is in the comments. These three pumpkins don't fit tea lights just based on how big the top hole ended up and the fact that, well, one's not even carved at all. I still like these a lot though, they're so fun. The rest of the jack-o'-lanterns can fit a battery-operated tea light, and I think they look so amazing all lit up. I love how fun they all turned out and how awesome they look with a light in them. I just love being able to take a handful of clay and make awesome stuff with it. It's so cool to me. While you're waiting on my start to finish video of these adorable mini pumpkins, you can check out my latest kiln opening. I put some of the mini pumpkins fused onto plates, and they turned out really cute. You can check out that video here in the link. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.